There are battles decided in hours. There are battles decided in days. And then there are battles decided by how long human beings can continue to exist inside them. In 1916, the war reached that point. Commanders no longer spoke confidently about breakthroughs or decisive maneuvers. Instead, they talked about pressure, about wearing the enemy down, about forcing collapse, not through speed or surprise, but through endurance. The assumption was simple: someone would break first. Verdun and the Somme were built on that assumption. Different plans, different fronts, different armies. The same belief that if enough men were fed into the fighting, if enough shells were fired, if enough time passed, the war could still be decided. It could not. What followed were not battles in the traditional sense. They were systems designed to consume men, material, and morale at a rate no society could sustain indefinitely. Battles where success was measured not in ground taken, but in suffering imposed. And once they began, stopping them became almost impossible. Not because no one wanted to, but because admitting failure meant admitting the entire logic of the war was broken. Before we go further, a content note: this episode deals directly with prolonged violence, mass casualties, and the lived experience of industrial warfare. We will not dwell on graphic detail, but we will talk plainly about death, endurance, and loss. My name is James, and this is Echoes of the Great War, Episode 8. In this episode, we're confronting the heart of the war's middle years. Verdun and the Somme, two battles often remembered separately, one as a symbol of endurance, the other as a symbol of catastrophe. Today, we'll treat them as part of the same story. We'll begin at Verdun, not with the fighting itself, but with the plan, the logic that made sense to the people who designed the battle. Then we'll follow what actually happened once that logic collided with reality, and see how endurance replaced maneuver as the defining feature of the war. From there, we'll step back and examine why commanders continued to believe in attrition, even as its costs became undeniable. And finally, we'll move to the Somme, a battle built on certainty, preparation, and confidence, and follow a single day where those assumptions collapsed almost immediately. Verdun and the Somme were not mistakes born of ignorance. They were the logical outcome of a war that no longer knew how to stop. Verdun was not chosen by accident. In late 1915, German leaders faced a problem that had become familiar. The Western Front was locked in stalemate. Breakthroughs were promised, attempted, and failed. Each offensive consumed men and material without delivering decision. Something had to change. For the German chief of the general staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, the solution was not movement, but pressure. Falkenhayn believed that Germany could not win the war through rapid maneuver alone. Britain's naval blockade tightened. Russia remained dangerous despite setbacks. Time, he feared, favored the Allies. So Falkenhayn reframed the problem. If Germany could not defeat its enemies outright, perhaps it could exhaust them. Verdun became the instrument of that idea. Verdun was a fortress complex in northeastern France, situated along the Meuse River, east of Paris. On a map, it was not the most strategically decisive position. It did not guard a direct route to the French capital. It did not promise dramatic territorial gain. What it offered instead was symbolism. Verdun had been a cornerstone of French defense for generations. It was woven into national memory, a place associated with resistance, sacrifice, and identity. Losing Verdun would not merely weaken France militarily. It would wound France psychologically. Falkenhayn understood this. He believed that if Germany threatened Verdun, France would feel compelled to defend it at any cost. And if France committed its army there, Germany could force a battle of attrition on terms of its choosing. This was the core of Falkenhayn's thinking. He did not seek a breakthrough. He sought a trap. The goal was not to take Verdun quickly, but to turn it into a grinder, a place where French forces would be drawn in repeatedly and destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Falkenhayn later described this as an effort to bleed France white. The phrase is chilling, but it reveals how the war was being reconceptualized. Victory was no longer defined by movement or conquest. It was defined by exhaustion. The plan rested on several assumptions. First, Falkenhayn believed German artillery superiority could dominate the battlefield. By 1916, Germany possessed immense firepower, carefully stockpiled shells, and well-prepared positions. Verdun, surrounded by hills and forts, could be pounded relentlessly. Second, he assumed France would respond predictably, that national pride and political pressure would override caution, forcing French commanders to defend Verdun no matter the cost. Third, he believed German losses could be kept lower than French ones by fighting from prepared positions and forcing the French to counterattack repeatedly. On paper, the logic was sound. It was systematic. It was controlled. It was industrial. The plan envisioned a battle fought less by maneuver than by mathematics, shells fired, men committed, casualties counted. But even at the planning stage, there were cracks. Verdun was not isolated. Supplying German forces would strain logistics. Terrain favored defenders as much as attackers. And once committed, Germany would also be unable to disengage without appearing to fail. Attrition cuts both ways. Still, the plan moved forward. Preparation was immense. German artillery was concentrated on an unprecedented scale. Forts were mapped carefully, ammunition stockpiles were built up quietly, rail lines were adjusted to support sustained bombardment. When the attack began on the 21st of February, 1916, it opened with one of the most intense artillery barrages the war had yet seen. Shells fell continuously. Fortifications collapsed. Villages disappeared. The opening phase worked tactically. German troops advanced. French positions were overwhelmed. The famous fort of Douaumont fell early, captured with surprising ease. From a narrow military perspective, the plan appeared vindicated. But something else happened. France did not withdraw. It reinforced. French commanders, recognizing the symbolic stakes, committed themselves fully. General Philippe Pétain reorganized defenses around rotation rather than replacement. Units were cycled through the front, spreading suffering across the army rather than allowing single formations to be destroyed outright. Verdun became a national effort. And that was exactly what Falkenhayn had expected. What he had not fully anticipated was how this would bind Germany as tightly as France. Every French reinforcement demanded a German response. Every gain required defense. Every escalation closed off the option of disengagement. The trap worked, just not in the way intended. Verdun did not bleed France alone. It began bleeding everyone. What makes Verdun unique is not simply its scale, but its intent. This was a battle designed from the beginning as an endurance contest, a place where suffering was not a byproduct, but a mechanism. That design matters. Verdun was not the result of blind momentum or accidental escalation. It was the product of a strategic choice, a belief that modern war could be decided by managing loss better than the enemy. That belief would shape the rest of the war. And at Verdun, it would be tested to destruction. Once Verdun began, it did not behave like a battle anymore. It behaved like a condition. The opening weeks shattered any remaining illusion that this would be a short, contained operation. German artillery continued to hammer French positions day and night. Infantry attacks followed, not in sweeping movements, but in grinding advances measured in yards. Ground was taken, then retaken, then pulverized into something barely recognizable as ground at all. What mattered was not speed, but persistence. This is where Verdun diverges sharply from earlier battles, especially those on the Eastern Front, like Tannenberg. At Tannenberg, collapse came quickly. Once Russian coordination failed, the battle resolved itself brutally and decisively. Armies were surrounded, captured, destroyed. Verdun offered no such resolution. Here, failure did not mean collapse. It meant replacement. When French units were shattered, they were not annihilated. They were withdrawn, if they could be, and replaced by others. The front did not give way. It absorbed punishment. This was not accidental. General Philippe Pétain, now responsible for Verdun's defense, made a critical decision early on. Instead of allowing units to remain until they broke, he instituted a system of rotation. Divisions would pass through Verdun, endure the front for a limited time, and then be relieved. The logic was grim, but deliberate. If Verdun was going to consume men, it would consume them evenly. Nearly 3/4 of the French army would eventually serve there. No single unit could claim exemption. No region of France could claim distance. Verdun became a shared national ordeal. The phrase most associated with the battle, "they shall not pass," captured this mentality. It was not a promise of victory, it was a refusal to collapse. Daily life at Verdun defies easy description. Artillery fire was nearly constant. Men lived in shell holes, collapsed trenches, and shattered forts. Sleep came in fragments. Supplies moved under fire along narrow roads. Most famously, the Voie Sacrée, the sacred way, a lifeline that ran day and night, hauling men, shells, food, and the wounded. The road itself became symbolic. As long as it functioned, Verdun held. As long as it held, the battle could not end. Casualties mounted relentlessly. Men were killed outright. Others were buried by shell fire. Gas drifted unpredictably through low ground. Disease spread in damp, overcrowded conditions. The wounded often waited hours, sometimes days, for evacuation. And still, the fighting continued. German forces experienced much of the same. They too rotated units. They too endured relentless bombardment. They too struggled with supply and exhaustion. The very logic meant to protect German manpower, fighting defensively, while the French attacked, eroded as the battle expanded. German troops were not merely inflicting attrition, they were absorbing it. By the summer of 1916, Verdun had become a closed system. Each side believed it could not stop without losing face, credibility, and purpose. Gains, once made, had to be held even when holding them offered no strategic advantage. This is the essence of endurance warfare. The goal shifts from winning to not losing, from decision to persistence, from strategy to survival. Verdun illustrates why attrition battles are so difficult to end. They generate their own justification. So much has already been spent, lives, resources, prestige, that stopping feels like waste. Every additional loss becomes an argument to continue, not to reconsider. This is what trapped both sides. Verdun did not reward innovation. It punished exposure. It favored depth, redundancy, and stubbornness. Attacks succeeded only temporarily. Defenses adapted quickly. Unlike Tannenberg, where operational failure led to immediate catastrophe, Verdun allowed failure to continue indefinitely. That was its cruelty. Casualty figures tell part of the story. By the end of the battle, roughly 300,000 men were dead, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. The exact numbers matter less than the pattern. Losses accumulated steadily. There was no single day that decided Verdun. There was no moment where the outcome became clear. It simply went on and on. Psychologically, Verdun broke something fundamental. Soldiers learned that bravery did not guarantee survival, that preparation did not prevent destruction, that there was no safe sector, no rear area untouched by fire. Time itself became an enemy. Men measured survival not in weeks or months, but in hours. One French soldier later wrote, "At Verdun, you did not ask when it would end. You asked whether you would leave." What Verdun produced was not victory in the traditional sense. It produced exhaustion. France did not collapse. Germany did not break through. Both endured. And in enduring, they normalized a form of warfare that would define the rest of the conflict. Verdun taught commanders that battles could be sustained without decision, that armies could absorb losses, far beyond what pre-war thinking considered possible. This lesson would be applied again, soon, not at Verdun, but along a different stretch of the Western Front, where another battle was already taking shape. One built on confidence rather than endurance, preparation rather than pressure. A battle that believed it could succeed where Verdun had merely survived. Verdun did not end with victory. It ended with continuation. And that distinction matters, because the lessons commanders drew from Verdun were not the ones the battlefield was actually teaching. From the perspective of senior leadership, Verdun proved something important. France had not broken. Germany had not collapsed. Despite catastrophic losses, both armies continued to function. Supply systems held. Morale bent, but did not shatter. To many commanders, this looked like confirmation. Attrition worked. Not quickly, not cleanly, but predictably. If an army could endure Verdun, it could endure almost anything. And if endurance could be organized, managed, supplied, rotated, then perhaps wars could be won by forcing the enemy to endure longer. This was a dangerous conclusion. What Verdun really demonstrated was not the effectiveness of attrition, but the resilience of modern states under extreme pressure. Industrial societies, it turned out, could absorb punishment on a scale that would have been unimaginable before the war. Commanders misread resilience as advantage. They mistook survival for progress. Nowhere was this clearer than in how Allied leaders interpreted Verdun while planning their own offensive. By the spring of 1916, pressure on the Allies was mounting. France was tied down at Verdun. Russia demanded relief on the Western Front. Britain, having expanded its army massively since 1914, faced political and military expectations it could no longer avoid. An offensive was coming. The question was how it would be fought. Verdun suggested one thing clearly: defense was powerful, but not invincible. Given enough artillery, enough preparation, and enough men, defenses could be crushed. The mistake lay in assuming that preparation guaranteed outcome. Artillery had devastated Verdun's landscape. Forts had fallen, positions had been erased. Commanders fixated on these visible effects and drew a simple conclusion. If artillery could destroy defenses, then infantry could walk through the ruins. This belief hardened into doctrine. Planning focused on accumulation rather than adaptation. Shell counts mattered more than flexibility. Timetables mattered more than uncertainty. The human element, morale, confusion, fear, exhaustion, was treated as something that could be managed from afar. And this belief did not emerge in isolation. It fit neatly into the industrial logic of the war. Factories produced shells in the millions. Railways delivered them on schedule. Charts tracked consumption. Losses could be replaced, at least on paper. When war begins to resemble production, decision makers begin to think in terms of throughput rather than consequence. This is where Verdun's lesson was misunderstood. Verdun did not succeed because of attrition. It failed to end because attrition could be endured. But endurance is not the same as victory. For the Allies, particularly Britain, Verdun created urgency. France needed relief. Britain needed to prove its army mattered. Political leaders needed visible action. The result was a growing consensus that a massive, carefully prepared offensive could break the deadlock, not through endurance alone, but through scale. What this overlooked was how Verdun had reshaped the battlefield itself. Continuous bombardment had not eliminated defense. It had driven it underground, trenches deepened, dugouts hardened, command structures adapted. Defense evolved faster than offense. Yet planning for the next major offensive treated Verdun as a proof of concept rather than a warning. Commanders believed they understood the problem. They did not yet understand how deeply it had changed. This gap between belief and reality is the connective tissue between Verdun and the Somme. Verdun normalized suffering without decision. The Somme would attempt to restore decision through suffering. Both were built on logic. Both were shaped by pressure. And both reveal how modern war trapped commanders inside systems that rewarded persistence over reconsideration. What mattered most was not that Verdun had failed to deliver victory. It was that no one could explain why without questioning the foundations of the war itself. And that question was too dangerous to ask. The Somme did not begin in chaos. It began in confidence. By early 1916, Allied commanders believed they finally understood the problem of the Western Front. The failure of earlier offensives, the stalemate of the trenches, even the grinding endurance of Verdun, all of it seemed to point toward a single conclusion. Firepower could decide the war. If defenses could be destroyed thoroughly enough, infantry would no longer need to fight their way forward. They would advance into a battlefield already neutralized. Resistance, it was assumed, would be minimal. Victory would follow naturally. The Somme became the test of that belief. Originally planned as a joint Franco-British offensive along the river Somme in northern France, the battle's purpose shifted as Verdun consumed French resources. Britain would now carry the main burden. This was not just a military necessity, it was a political one. Britain had raised a vast new army since the start of the war. Volunteers had poured in during 1914 and 1915. These men had trained for months, sometimes more than a year. The nation expected them to matter. So did their commanders. General Douglas Haig, now commander of the British Expeditionary Force, believed the Somme could deliver a decisive blow. Not necessarily end the war outright, but break the deadlock and restore movement. Preparation became everything. Artillery was the centerpiece of the plan. For 7 days before the infantry attack, British and French guns would bombard German positions continuously. Millions of shells would be fired. Trenches would be obliterated. Barbed wire shredded. Dugouts collapsed. This was not guesswork. It was calculation. Staff officers measured frontage, shell density, and timing. Schedules were drawn up with industrial precision. Each gun had assigned targets. Each unit knew exactly when it would advance. The logic was simple. No enemy could survive this. Confidence extended beyond the guns. Infantry were instructed that once the barrage lifted, they would advance in orderly lines. Not rushing, not scrambling. Walking forward, rifles at the ready. Resistance, they were told, would be scattered at most. Some units were even ordered to carry extra equipment tools, wire, supplies to consolidate captured ground quickly. These were not the orders of men expecting heavy resistance. They were the orders of men expecting success. Training reinforced this expectation. Soldiers rehearsed advances behind mock barrages. Officers emphasized discipline and timing over improvisation. The war, it seemed, had been reduced to a problem of coordination. Underlying all of this was a profound belief in destruction. Artillery was seen not as a supporting arm, but as the decisive one. If enough shells fell in the right places, infantry combat would become secondary. The enemy would be stunned, demoralized, and incapable of organized defense. What this belief underestimated was adaptation. German defenses along the Somme had not remained static. Trenches had deepened. Dugouts were reinforced with timber and concrete. Positions were layered, with secondary and tertiary lines prepared to absorb attack. More importantly, German soldiers had learned how to survive bombardment. When shelling intensified, they went underground. When it lifted, they emerged quickly, often within minutes, ready to man machine guns and fire positions that artillery could not reliably destroy. These realities were known in theory, but they were discounted. Commanders trusted their numbers. The bombardment was unprecedented in scale. Over 1.5 million shells would be fired by British guns alone. Such volume, it was believed, must produce results. There was also pressure. France needed relief from Verdun. Russia needed relief on the Eastern Front. Political leaders needed proof that sacrifice was producing progress. The Somme offered all of that, or so it seemed. As the days of bombardment passed, optimism grew. Reports described devastated enemy lines. Observation balloons spotted craters where trenches once ran. Some officers walked forward to inspect ground they believed already conquered. Soldiers wrote letters home, expressing confidence. Many believed the worst danger was already over. One British private later recalled being told, "You'll be across in minutes. Just keep your spacing, and you'll be through." This was not arrogance. It was faith. Faith in preparation, faith in planning, faith that the war had finally been understood. What makes the Somme so important is not just what happened next, but what commanders believed would happen next. They believed they had solved the problem of modern warfare. They believed destruction could substitute for uncertainty. They believed that discipline and firepower could remove friction from battle. On the eve of the attack, nothing about the plan felt reckless. It felt inevitable. The guns had spoken. The defenses were assumed gone. All that remained was to advance. The 1st of July, 1916, began quietly. Along the Somme front, dawn broke through a haze of smoke and dust left by 7 days of bombardment. The guns fell silent. For the first time in a week, there was something like stillness. To many soldiers, that silence felt reassuring. It sounded like success. At 7:30 in the morning, whistles blew. British infantry climbed out of their trenches and began to advance. They moved forward in long lines, spaced carefully, exactly as planned. Some carried rifles. Others carried picks, shovels, wire cutters, even footballs. Officers walked rather than ran, believing speed unnecessary. They expected shattered defenses. What they encountered instead was organized fire. German soldiers, who had spent the bombardment sheltered deep in reinforced dugouts, emerged almost immediately once the shelling stopped. Machine guns were pulled into position. Artillery observers called down fire on pre-registered zones. The ground the British advanced across was wide, open, and unforgiving. Within minutes, entire units were pinned down. Some never made it halfway. The scale of the shock was immediate. Men fell in rows. Communication broke down almost instantly. Runners were killed. Telephone lines were cut. Officers trying to push forward according to the plan found themselves unable to see more than a few yards ahead through smoke and dust. Yet the advance continued. Not because it was working, but because stopping had not been anticipated. At 8:30, reports began reaching headquarters that progress was limited or non-existent. In some sectors, gains were minimal. In others, units had been annihilated. But these reports were fragmentary, conflicting, delayed. The plan assumed success, and early information was interpreted through that assumption. Artillery schedules moved forward. Reserves were committed. By mid-morning, entire battalions had ceased to exist as effective fighting units. One British regiment recorded over 500 casualties in less than 30 minutes. Another advanced nearly a mile and then was forced back, having lost most of its officers. In a few isolated sectors, limited success occurred. Some German trenches were taken. Small footholds were established. But these successes were exceptions. They were drowned out by the scale of failure elsewhere. By noon, it was clear to many officers at the front that the offensive had failed. But at higher levels, the picture remained unclear. The machinery of the attack continued. Orders went out to renew advances. Men already pinned down were told to move forward again. Units with no communication were assumed to be progressing. This disconnect between reality and command would define the day. The casualties mounted relentlessly. By the afternoon, wounded men clogged the battlefield. Stretcher bearers worked under fire, often for hours, to move a single casualty a few hundred yards. Aid stations overflowed. Some wounded lay where they had fallen until night. By evening, the scale of the disaster could no longer be denied. When the counts were finally assembled, the numbers were staggering. The British Army had suffered roughly 57,000 casualties in a single day. Of those, nearly 19,000 were dead. It was the bloodiest day in British military history. German losses were far lower estimates, ranged between 10 and 12,000 casualties, devastating, but nowhere near the scale inflicted on the attackers. And yet, the battle did not end. This is the most important part. Despite the catastrophe of the first day, the Somme continued for months. Why? Because the logic that produced the plan did not collapse with it. Commanders did not interpret the first day as proof the concept was flawed. They interpreted it as imperfect execution. The artillery, they believed, had not been quite sufficient. The timing could be adjusted, the tactics refined. The solution was not to stop. It was to try again. And again. The Somme reveals something essential about industrial war. Once an offensive is launched, it acquires momentum of its own. Men are committed, supplies are in motion, political expectations are engaged. Stopping becomes harder than continuing. The battle had been designed as a demonstration of certainty. What it became was a demonstration of endurance, not unlike Verdun. But unlike Verdun, where endurance was the goal, the Somme endured because it could not easily be undone. The illusion that shattered on the 1st of July was not belief in bravery or discipline. It was belief in control. The belief that planning could eliminate uncertainty, that firepower could replace friction, that human beings could be moved through devastation according to schedule. The men who walked forward that morning believed the worst danger was behind them. They were wrong, but what followed mattered just as much. The war did not pause to reflect. It absorbed the lesson and continued anyway. In this episode, we followed two battles that came to define the middle of World War I. Not because they decided the war, but because they revealed what the war had become. At Verdun, we saw a battle designed around endurance rather than decision. A plan built on the belief that modern armies could be broken psychologically, not through maneuver, but through sustained pressure. What emerged instead was a closed system of suffering, one that consumed men and material without delivering resolution, and that neither side could abandon without admitting failure. At the Somme, we saw a different illusion collapse. Here, commanders believed preparation had solved uncertainty, that artillery, planning, and discipline could neutralize defense itself. On the first day, that certainty shattered, but the offensive did not stop. It continued, driven by momentum, obligation, and the refusal to accept that the underlying logic might be flawed. Together, Verdun and the Somme reveal the central tragedy of the war's middle years. Endurance without decision. Decision without understanding. Attrition became normalized. Casualties became statistics. Human cost became something to be managed rather than avoided. And most dangerously, the war learned that it could go on, that societies could absorb loss far beyond what anyone had imagined before 1914, that armies could endure disasters without collapsing, that even failure did not necessarily force change, but endurance has limits. By the end of 1916, those limits were beginning to show, not always at the front, but at home, in factories, in streets, in bread lines, and in the quiet exhaustion of populations asked to give more than they had. The war had survived its bloodiest tests. The question now was whether the world fighting it could. In the next episode, we'll step away from the battlefield and look inward at societies stretched to the breaking point. We'll explore how total war reshaped civilian life, how governments managed belief in dissent, and how pressure at home began to shape decisions at the front. Because the next great battles of the war would not only be fought with guns and shells, they would be fought inside nations themselves. That's next time on Echoes of the Great War.
Thank you for listening to Echoes of the Great War. If you'd like to learn more about the Great War, we recommend reading The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark and The First World War by Hugh Strachan. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a comment and share us with others. And to be the first to know when new episodes and seasons are released, you can follow the show on your preferred podcast platform and on social media by searching for Echoes of War Pod.